So, as I mentioned in the reading questions at the beginning, the progressive era is sort of all over the place. And I don't think Foner did you any favors with the way he organized it. So, if my narrative seems a little convoluted, it's because Foner's narrative is a little convoluted. And I actually just wanted to keep you going, forward through the pages. So, we'll go back to a little information that's back from chapter 17 during the Gilded Age in the 1890s. And the 1890s really is sort of a precursor, in some ways, a bridge between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And the 1890s launched what would later be called the Women's Era, really 3 decades, 1890s, 1900s, and 1910 or 1910s, in which women, although still not able to vote until the 19th Amendment at the end of that third decade, started to enjoy larger opportunities when it came to economic independence and then a greater and greater role in public life, particularly as they lobbied for political change. So nearly 5 million women worked for wages, at the turn of the century in 1900. Most were young and unmarried and still in sort of the traditional women's work, such as domestic servant. That means, maids and house cleaning and things like that. And in the garment industry. But you're starting to see a larger group of college educated women. And again, so women's colleges became much more popular 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So you're going to start to see women that are coming out that are taking more professional positions. And again, not many professional opportunities for women, but the more educated people you have, the more that starts to happen. So you have a very important organization actually headquartered out of Evanston, Illinois, called the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so you're going to see that as an organization that plays a major role in exerting sort of women's influence on public affairs. And the WCTU started really by focusing on temperance, limiting alcoholic beverages. But then it moved from this sort of, blaming alcohol for men, spending all their money on alcohol and abusing their wives to really a much more comprehensive program of political and economic reform, including the right to vote. So much like we saw in the antebellum reform movement, where you have a bunch of different reformers, focused on a bunch of different issues. So someone who's involved in, trying to get women the right to vote might also be involved in abolition. Here you're going to have women who are involved not only in temperance but also in suffrage as well. And so one of the main leaders in the women's rights movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Carrie Chapman Catt, had said, listen, okay, at the end of the day, immigrants and former slaves have been given the right to vote. And she said with what was known as ill-advised haste. So it actually comes across rather racist towards Black people. It says, as the president of what was known as NASA, or the National American Women's Suffrage Association, she's like, you know what? We need to make sure that native-born white women, so again, racial undertones, or not even undertones, perhaps overtones there, would really counteract the growing power of the ignorant foreign vote. So it's like, well, we gave ignorant foreigners the right to vote. We got to allow white women the right to vote, basically to ensure that those ignorant voters can't change policy. Okay. And again, at the same time, trying to make sure that there couldn't be sort of a second Reconstruction in the South. So again, trying to appeal to Southerners at the same time. It says, you know what, watch out. If we give Black people, which we did in the 15th Amendment, too much power, then look what could happen. So again, the progressive era, progressive in terms of giving women the right, or trying to get women the right to vote, but certainly not progressive in terms of relying on this sort of very xenophobic and racist language as well. So now we're going to be on chapter 18. And, I rarely ask questions at sort of the beginning of the chapter and sort of the narrative they lay out, but I think that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is really important and illustrative for us to understand. So there's about 500 women workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, who are working basically in what is known as a sweatshop, working at sewing machines, creating these ladies' blouses known as shirtwaists. They make very little money, and a fire starts. And those, that are up there on the like 7th through 10th floors, they try to escape down the stairwells, but they've been locked because the owners have been concerned about theft and don't want them taking unauthorized bathroom breaks. The fire department does arrive, but they can't get the hoses up high enough. And so women are literally jumping, from the seventh, eighth floors down. And so people burn inside, people jump to their death. And there's about 100, and I think 50 women who die in the building. Now, again, there actually aren't a ton of changes that are really made as a result of this, which is really sort of interesting because we're supposed to be talking about this era of change. The state of New York does have some sort of worker safety policies that come out of it. But I think more than anything, it really shows the conditions in some ways left over from the Gilded Age that progressives are trying to ultimately change. So who are these progressives? They've got a bunch of different sort of avenues that they come from. So they include businessmen who believe, workers must have much more of a voice. You've got labor leaders who are like, we need to make sure that workers have a voice. So again, interestingly, that you'd have business leaders involved in that as well. You've got female reformers who want to protect women and children from exploitation. You've got academic researchers, social scientists who think, we have research that will help solve social problems. You've got, again, members of an anxious middle class who think that if big business gets too big, they're going to be locked out from that opportunity as well. So again, you've got rich people, poor people, academics, who all are interested in quote unquote this progress that's at the root of the word progressive. So one of the most important texts that comes out of the progressive era is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Now, there are a bunch of what are called muckrakers who are journalists who are trying to expose social and economic ills. Some are writing in magazines, and then people like Upton Sinclair wrote a book. And it's probably considered the most influential of all of the texts from this era. And written in 1906, it described the unsanitary slaughterhouses in Chicago and the sale of rotten meat. And although your book doesn't say this, I'll mention this much more in lecture. It stirred public outrage, but Upton Sinclair was not trying to write it so that people would be upset about like what's going on with the meat. He wanted to make it really an attack on capitalism, as he was a socialist. But instead, it really just made people nauseated and made them want to pass what is known as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which made sure that, again, the food was packaged correctly and labeled correctly, as well as the Meat Inspection Act for meat that crossed state lines to make sure that it was actually sanitary. So again, now, government was reacting to a book and creating laws to help really protect consumers in that regard. But really, the immediate task of the progressives, as they saw it, was to make sure that you could have a society where you sort of limited the negative effects of industrial capitalism. Again, that's what we saw with industrialization, and make sure that, all of the labor conflict that was going on, really could be settled in a way that was much more favorable to the workers. And so when we think about lack of industrial freedom, that means, again, workers working too long in unsafe conditions for very little pay was thought to be, again, a major problem, just as it had been in the Gilded Age. But now many progressives are actually buying into the idea that labor unions and empowering workers to participate in economic decision making will be better for society. So whereas labor unions couldn't get a lot of traction in the Gilded Age, now you've got people that are saying, it's actually a pretty good idea. People even like Louis Brandeis, who will be the first Jewish man or woman who gets to be on the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. Now, there's also the emergence, not of socialism, which we'd actually seen in the past, going back to the Gilded Age. We certainly saw that associated with labor after Haymarket, but we have the Socialist Party, which is founded in 1901. And some of their, reforms that they call for actually sort of feel like Bernie Sanders-esque, like calling for free college education, legislation to improve, the rights of workers, and really something that is only slightly Bernie-esque, but democratic control over the economy through public ownership of railroads and factories. And again, that's something that we'd seen going back to ideas that the populists had brought up, ideas that even the Knights of Labor had brought up. But then again, couldn't get traction before. But now that you've got sort of more middle class, educated people calling for it, it's now getting much more respect. So the socialists, believe it or not, had power really in the Lower East Side of New York City, as well as Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of all places. And the man who actually becomes the most sort of famous socialist in American history is none other than Eugene V. Debs, who we last saw being, imprisoned as a result of breaking the law, the injunction against the Pullman strike. Now, there was, in fact, a union that sort of was much more tied to the socialists, and that's the Wobblies, or the International Workers of the World. So whereas the AFL was dealing with the most privileged workers, remember the skilled workers that called craft unionists, most of those workers were white, they were male, they were native born. So again, excluding the your game or your goat or your guy of the world. In 1905, you're going to have the IWW, the Wobblies, who are partly a union and partly sort of an advocate of a workers' revolution. And they really do want the workers to seize the means of production, sort of calling on what we saw with Karl Marx. And they're really all about solidarity. So in some ways, their inclusive nature sort of echoed the Knights of Labor from before, and they're going to try to mobilize those people that are excluded from the AFL, mostly, the unskilled workers, the migrant timber and agricultural workers, women, African Americans, and even the Chinese workers. So they never get to be anywhere as big or even as powerful as the Knights of Labor, but they sort of are a second coming of the Knights of Labor with an even more radical agenda. When we look at strikes in this era, the one that we have to look at is at Lawrence, Massachusetts, known as the Bread and Roses strike. And, again, we've seen mills going all the way back to Lowell, certainly in the antebellum era, and it continued to be very much a textile area. And so you have, over 30,000 men, women, and children in this particular area. And the state legislature wants to basically limit the work week, which is good for workers, but then employers decided to reduce wages. So in the end, the workers were hurt. So the workers went on strike. But what gets really interesting is the workers say, you know what, we're going to send our children out of, the city for this, in part because no one will be there to take care of them. So this is happening, near Boston, but socialist families in New York agree to take them in. And so even though it was happening in Massachusetts, the sight of these children in New York City, many of them who really look quite destitute, marching up Fifth Avenue in New York, gave a ton of sympathy actually for their parents back who were striking in Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts actually intervened, and the strike was settled on the workers' terms. And there's a famous banner that was used during this strike that gave a new slogan to the labor movement. It says, "We want bread and roses." So the idea was, we don't just want, the holy trinity of higher wages and, better working conditions and lower hours, but we actually want to enjoy the finer things in life. So why should we be reduced just to the holy trinity? We actually want more. Okay. So when we think about wanting more, again, I don't mean to have a bad segue here, but we're starting to think of the emergence of really the feminist movement. And I know I talked about the WCTU, I talked about NASA, I talked about Carrie Chapman Catt, but now we're going to sort of be more looking at feminism in the 1990s. And we're going to start to see this idea of women calling for more freedom in terms of sexual expression and reproductive choice. So really, when I say reproductive choice, I'm talking about really the beginning almost of the pro-choice movement. And so the name we associate with that is Margaret Sanger. So Margaret Sanger in 1911 began writing a column on sex ed, which was a very taboo subject back then. It was called What Every Girl Should Know, and it was in a New York socialist newspaper. Now, the post office, the government post office, said in one case that you can't publish this particular issue. It was a column on sexually transmitted diseases. And so in the next issue, she had this blank page with the headline, What Every Girl Should Know, Nothing, by the order of the U.S. Postal Service, basically saying the government is trying to keep women in the dark about sexually transmitted diseases. And in 1914, she openly starts advertising birth control in her journal, not the socialist journal she'd been writing for, but it's called Woman Rebel. And 2 years later, she opens up a clinic in a working class neighborhood of Brooklyn, and she starts giving basically contraceptive devices to poor Jewish and Italian women. So basically, she starts, distributing birth control, and she's sentenced to a month in prison. Now, she's going to basically be the beginning of what is known as Planned Parenthood, which is where women go to have abortions. So in many ways, the name Margaret Sanger still is very relevant today in the overall pro-life, pro-choice debate. Remember, pro-choice is people that want women to be able to have the choice, and pro-life is anti-abortion. Okay. Now, I know that we had talked sort of at the end of the Native American sort of fight in 1890 at Wounded Knee, but there is a moment both during this progressive era and also during the New Deal under FDR where Native Americans sort of push back again. So you have a group known as the Society of American Indians. It's a reform organization. It brings together a bunch of different people, Indian intellectuals, to promote discussions really about what can be done with Native Americans to help them. And there is a leader named Carlos Montezuma, who's really an outspoken critic of what the organization is trying to do. And he's like, listen, we are Native Americans. We should not be listening to outsiders. They shouldn't have any say about life on the res or reservations. And remember, the Dawes Act busted up a bunch of reservations, but not all of them. And he's like, self-determination, which means making their own decisions, is the only way for Indians to escape poverty and being on the margins. And he demanded that Indians be granted full citizenship and full constitutional rights, which they don't still have. So again, this is sort of a call again for Native American rights. It doesn't really go that far, but I just wanted to bring it up. I think it's important to recognize that during times of change, many different groups sort of get a voice. Although during this era, African Americans are still pretty marginalized. Although there are people like W.E.B. Du Bois who do start the NAACP during this era. And we certainly talked about him when we talked about Booker T and W.E.B. Now, when we again sort of think about what is the ultimate goal of the progressives, well, they want the government to solve the problems. They want what is known as an activist, socially conscious government. Now, they have to then sort of transcend the longtime belief by Americans that a powerful government poses a threat to freedom. Okay. So again, going even all the way back to the whole reason that you had the Articles of Confederation after the American Revolution, it's like too big of a government is going to, infringe on freedom. And we've seen that yin and the yang throughout American history about states' rights versus stronger federal government. But in order for the progressives' plan, and they didn't have one unified plan, but for the different plans to work, you needed a government that was going to be able to do its job. The problem is that you really had many different levels of government that were supposed to do the job. You have the federal government, you have state and local governments. That's the whole idea of federalism, this sharing as well as this distribution or division of power. And so what you had a bunch of cities that were, run by party bosses, like, Boss Tweed at Tammany Hall, and they were really corrupt. So what you had to have city government basically cleaning up city government. And, some of the changes that city governments made was really to take over the gas and the waterworks, which had been basically private companies, and politicians had really taken bribes and really benefited from those. They improved public transportation. They raised property taxes, again, to be able to spend money on things like schools and parks and other public facilities. So cleaning up city government was very, very important. And you also had something that was to clean up state government. So an example of that would be the Oregon system. And there's a number of changes, or I should say policies, that were put into place to allow the voice to really sort of come back to the people. So the first one's the initiative, aka direct legislation. And in an initiative system, it allows citizens to basically get enough signatures to put a policy idea on the ballot. So ordinarily, politicians who are elected, they decide what laws are going to be on the ballot. Well, here it would be the citizens sign a petition to get a change that they want voted on. Now, they put it on the ballot. The referendum is when it gets voted on. So, for example, California still has initiatives and referenda. So, for example, if you get enough signatures back in the day, it would be like, we want medical marijuana. That would be on the ballot. It wasn't the politicians who decided, it was actually the citizens. The referendum is when it actually gets voted on by the people. So the initiative is where it gets initiated onto the ballot. The referendum is where it gets referred back to the people for the vote. Okay. And then California famously still has a recall. In fact, they recalled a few governors ago. Governor Gray Davis was recalled, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually elected governor of California. Basically, the recall says if a politician is corrupt or not doing what we want, we can recall them, and we actually have that in Illinois now that we had some real issues with Governor Rod Blagojevich. Then you have what's known as the direct primary, and instead of sort of elite party bosses choosing who the candidate would be for let's say senator from Illinois, or even the Democratic candidate or Republican candidate, now you're going to actually have the people deciding. And that's what we have when we have primaries. So we have primary elections where the people decide who the party's candidate is going to be. Obviously Joe Biden was for the Democrats and Trump was for the Republicans, and then they run against each other. Okay. Now you have the Oregon system out on the West Coast, and then you have the Wisconsin idea right here in the Midwest. Now, it's really interesting to think because Wisconsin is actually a very red state right now, but for a long time, it was a very progressive state. Even though Bob La Follette, Fighting Bob, was a Republican, it was a different kind of Republican Party back then. And Fighting Bob La Follette really looked at Wisconsin as a potential for this Democratic laboratory. And he instituted a ton of different policies in his Wisconsin idea. So certainly the direct primaries, taxing companies, because saying, hey, listen, they're super wealthy, we can get the money and give it to the poor. State regulation of railroads, again, almost a Granger type idea. Also, insurance against when you get sick or you die or have an accident. He made sure that basically the state wasn't selling a bunch of state land to private developers, giving up natural resources and mineral rights in the process. Also, safety devices on machinery. So absolutely making sure that working conditions were safer and prohibiting child labor. So again, really sort of all over the board there. And, Fighting Bob was very, very popular in Wisconsin for what he was able to do, and ultimately ran for president in 1912 and was elbowed out of the way by Teddy Roosevelt. We'll talk about that later. So we know that there was the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15, 13 freeing slaves, 14 providing for citizenship as well as civil rights, and 15 providing African American males suffrage. We'll get to the 16th Amendment in a minute, but the 17th Amendment allowed for what were known as direct election of senators. So remember, up until this point, representatives were elected by the people. The president was technically elected by the Electoral College, and senators were elected by the state legislature. So you would elect people down to Springfield, and then Springfield would decide who the senators were that went to Washington. So now you're going to have the direct election of senators, so making all of the legislative branch directly elected by the people, again, giving power back to the people. But when you think about power given back to the people, there are actually some ways during the Progressive era where it was taken away. So certainly we saw throughout the Jim Crow era and into the 1900s, there's, African Americans are still being disenfranchised. So even though you've got the Progressive era going on mostly in the North, African Americans are not getting voting rights in the South really anytime until 1965 and what's known as the Voting Rights Act. Now, there was also an effort in the cities to make sure that these party bosses didn't have a ton of power. So they actually replaced mayors with what were known as nonpartisan commissioners or city managers. So they actually hired like professional city leaders, which is good because it made sure there wasn't corrupt mayors in there. But at the same time, since these people weren't elected and they were appointed by the city council, it took basically the voice and choice away from the people. And there also are literacy tests and residency and registration requirements that were both in the North and the South. So certainly affecting African Americans in the South, but also poor whites in the North. So again, poor people in the North and the South, when it came to voting, were being restricted in some ways. Now, what's interesting is that people like Fightin' Bob La Follette really started to rely on college professors at this time. Yes, social scientists. And the belief is that actually expertise, like empirical data, was important. And, Fighting Bob was like, listen, we can improve society through impartial experts who don't have to worry about the public. Since they're not elected, they can give us the facts and we can use the facts to effectively create a better government. So we can clean up government by making it not about politicians making choices, but actually people who do the actual research and know this stuff. Okay. And 1 second, let me make sure I got my notes. Okay, so we know that women are heavily involved in the progressive era, just as they've been heavily involved in the antebellum reform effort way back in the 1830s and 1840s. Now, women in most states still cannot vote by the progressive era. 1869 was the first time we see a woman being allowed to vote in a state in Wyoming, of all places, but it's slow going. Okay. I don't know if 1869 is when the Wisconsin Territory did it or the state. I want to think it's a territory. I think I got the date wrong there. But the immediate catalyst for women getting involved is looking around and looking at the poor communities and looking at poor women and poor children and not wanting them to be exploited. So the most famous woman in America, really as a result of her progressive efforts, was Jane Addams. And, most people who'd worked with the poor sort of did it from a distance. But Jane Addams and other settlement house workers went straight to the poor neighborhoods and they lived there. Okay. They lived amongst the poor. And Jane Addams at her Hull House, which is a settlement house, it's not a hotel, it's not a hostel, it's not an inn, it's not apartments. It's basically a big community center. They built kindergartens and playgrounds for children, established health clinics, helped people get jobs, helped women who were being domestically abused to get legal protection. They were really working there to help the immigrants in the community, not be so downtrodden and destitute and be able to work their way up. And Jane Addams herself represented this sort of new change, that what we call the new woman in the progressive era, because she was college educated. And by 1900, there are almost 100,000 college educated women in the United States. And most, again, are, doing nursing and educating. But what you're going to start to see is the efforts of middle class, and in Jane Addams' case, upper middle class women working to uplift the poor, and really shifting government much more to being an activist government. So these middle class and upper middle class women really understand how to get things done at the government level, and then also get involved in this sort of new industry of social work, which provides new opportunities for women. And in fact, Whole House didn't just offer these services and programs to immigrants. They actually successfully lobbied for um, sanitation requirements within the city, shorter working hours, safer labor conditions. They were pro-labor overall. So, Jane Addams is one of those great examples of people who moved into the city, worked with the poor, but then also was able to create lasting legislative change for the poor. And, overall, there's this effort to focus not just on the women who are doing the work, but also legislation that would help women. And at the time, this was known as Maternalist Reforms. And the goal was to really improve the living standards of poor mothers and children. And they did help create laws providing for mothers' pensions, again, money from the government, and state aid to mothers of young children who couldn't work and needed, extra resources. So this whole idea of reforms for women was based on the assumption that the government needed to help women improve in terms of bearing and raising children. And again, it's not saying that they were deficient at it in terms of what I say improvement, but it's to basically say they need to be supported, because if they're not, then you're going to continue to have generations of children that are very, very poor. So we want to make sure that women can be more economically independent, raise their kids in an environment of economic independence. Now, speaking of women being empowered, there's a very interesting case of Mueller versus Oregon. And what you had in the Mueller versus Oregon case was a debate about whether there could be a law that said that women can only work a certain number of hours, which again, remember, labor movement wanted, a restriction on hours. And Louis Brandeis, who's going to later become the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, he filed his brief in front of the Supreme Court, citing scientific and sociological studies that say women are not as strong. They don't have the endurance that men do. Therefore, these longer hours in the factories are dangerous to women. And we have to understand that women are physically different. They give birth to children, and that's, a real physical difference. And so women should be treated differently than men. And so the Supreme Court actually bought this argument. And they're like, yeah, okay, women can have these shorter work days. Now, that's very different than what we'd originally seen in a case 3 years prior to that, in 1905, that I actually talked about in previous reading questions, called the Lochner case, in which the state of New York had tried to create a maximum hours, I believe it was 10 hours for bakers. And when the employers balked at that and said, no, you can't limit that limits how much money these workers can make, the Supreme Court said, yeah, in a capitalist world, you should be able to work as much as you want. Limiting hours is unconstitutional. But in Mueller, they said limiting hours for women is constitutional. Now, what's fascinating about that is that seems like a giant win for women. But in the end, they sort of created a legal definition of women as weaker and inferior. And when you're going to try to make an argument later on that women are the same as men and deserve the same rights as men, you just look at what the Supreme Court said. And they said, no, actually, women are inferior. And so how do you take that legal definition of them as inferior and try to reconcile that with trying to make an argument that they should be given equal rights? Now, totally switching gears here. The New Republic was a very important publication back in this era, and they had a very influential editor named Herbert Crawley. And he had an interesting sort of way of combining the rival traditions of Jefferson's sort of, democratic self-determination and freedom. Remember that, it's all about the independent farmer. There shouldn't be a big government. And then he said, well, in order to have that individual freedom, you need to bring in Hamilton's idea of a much bigger government. So in order to get the freedom that Jefferson wanted, you actually need to have a big government like that Hamilton had proposed. Okay. Now, the president that we most associate with the beginning of the progressive era is Teddy Roosevelt. And of course, we saw Teddy as the Undersecretary of the Navy, sending Dewey off to the Philippines. He will become the vice president under McKinley. McKinley's shot, and then he becomes the president. So goes from vice president to president, and he will have one term that he actually runs for himself. And Teddy had something called the square deal, which really at the time meant a fair deal. And one of the distinctions that Teddy made was between what he called good and bad sort of trusts, or good or bad monopolies. He didn't say that all monopolies were bad. And in his mind, there were good monopolies, such as U.S. Steel, again, a company that was originally had been Carnegie's company and was actually bought by J.P. Morgan. Standard Oil, owned by John David Rockefeller. He said these actual companies, they serve the public interest because they're so big, they have economies of scale, they can actually drive prices down. But then he also said, you know what, we have some other monopolies where it's just a bunch of, robber barons who want to exploit people. So again, Teddy wasn't anti-monopoly per se. He was anti-bad monopoly, but he thought some monopolies were good. Now, one of those monopolies that he thought was bad was called the Northern Securities Company. And Teddy sort of shocked everybody when he went after this particular Northern Securities Company, which is owned by J.P. Morgan, one of the richest men in the United States and the world. So it's interesting that actually Teddy was okay with J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel, but not okay with the railroad company that he went after, Northern Securities. And he used the Sherman Antitrust Act. Remember, Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed for the people, but had been used against labor unions, was now actually being used to go after monopolies. So in the end, the Supreme Court agrees with Teddy in saying that it's an unfair business practice, and they dissolve this major company, Northern Securities, which is a huge win for the antitrust movement and a huge win for Teddy Roosevelt, who believed in what was known as the big stick policy. Like, he wasn't afraid of anybody. He was going to go after you if he didn't like what you were doing. Now, another policy that sort of gave teeth to the toothless ICC was known as the Heparin Act. And it gave that Interstate Commerce Act the power to actually look at businesses and set reasonable rates. Remember, the ICC was instituted after Wabash, where the government's like, no, 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 we'll make sure there are fair railroad rates for you farmers, and they never did. Well, about a decade and a half later, they actually did. And it's interesting because you have the Heparin Act, which is really limiting how much businesses can charge. You've got the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is, again, really scrutinizing what, how food can be labeled and packaged, going back to what we saw with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And you would think that businesses wouldn't want this restriction. But in fact, many businesses did support this because they realized that if the government was putting its imprint on it, it would give greater public confidence to consumers, and now people would believe much more in them. But at the same time, they didn't like certain things, like Teddy calling for federal inheritance taxes and income taxes and more of the regulation of interstate commerce. So they liked what Teddy was doing in terms of instilling confidence in their products, but they didn't like some of the government overreach that they thought that he was doing. Now, Teddy had a good friend named John Muir. Again, I was born on February 5th, 1978 at John Muir Hospital. In fact, his home was about, a couple miles from where my high school girlfriend lived. And John Muir looked at nature, particularly forests, and called them God's first temples. And he really believed, like the transcendentalists, way back, in the 1830s, like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, that when you were in nature, you could experience God. Now, the transcendentalists really called it transcendence or communing with the oversoul, but Muir was much more about God. But what's interesting is that as more and more people went to cities, Muir tried to convince them, listen, like nature is not something to conquer and turn into, concrete jungles, but it's a place for recreation and even personal growth. And so Teddy really followed, in some ways, the blueprint of a guy like Muir, and he actually withdrew forest reserves from economic development, basically saying this is off limits, which in some ways, takes away from the capitalist system in the name of the greater good, which, is interesting. As a result of industrialization, people are looking to develop and develop and develop, and Teddy's like, no, 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 certain stuff can't be built on. And Teddy was a famous outdoorsman who built his own ranch in North Dakota in the 1880s and really believed in the restorative aspects of nature. And he had a really good friend named Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service. And so together they set aside millions of acres to be used as wildlife preserves and really encouraged more national parks to be built. And, it's sort of weird, like how is preserving nature a progressive reform? But it's very much expert driven. The government could, do a lot of analysis. And in many ways, they could serve the little guy, if you will, by, preventing businesses from coming in and causing irreparable damage to the environment. And so, yes, it doesn't feel like it's going to necessarily help the poor person in the cities to create national parks, but in some ways really the concern was for the vulnerable people in society. In this way, they're treating the environment as sort of a vulnerable entity as well. Now, Gifford Pinchot, who had a tremendous amount of influence just as the head of the U.S. Forest Service, he tried to make sure that there wasn't a reckless assault on the nation's forests by timber companies. But he differed from John Muir. John Muir basically believed that nature should be totally off limits, whereas Teddy and Pinchot believed that you could have development and conservation work sort of hand in hand in some ways. Like you could still have logging and mining and grazing on public lands while having people, enjoy nature and it could be conserved. So there was a way to do both. And that's something called multiple use resource management. Foner doesn't mention it, but I will mention it in class. Okay. Now, after Teddy comes his sort of handpicked successor, William Howard Taft. And Taft was probably more conservative overall than Teddy, but he ended up being even more of a trust buster than Teddy. Teddy was known as this trust buster, partly because of that whole Northern Securities case, but actually Taft was more of one. And actually Taft went after one of the good trusts that Teddy said could stay, which was Rockefeller Standard Oil. And in fact, by going after Standard Oil, it certainly made Taft look progressive, but it also pissed off some of Teddy's people. And the whole point is that Teddy's going to actually come back and run later on against his handpicked successor because he's pissed off at all the things that Taft does that he thinks are undoing what he had done. Now, one of the elements that Taft supported was the 16th Amendment, which allowed for a graduated income tax. It's basically where wealthier people pay at a higher tax rate. And again, that would bring in more money to the government, which was needing more money in order to, again, provide more programs to the people. So an income tax hike on the rich people would really help the poor people overall. And so that was, again, now we've got 13, 14, 15. Those are Reconstruction. 16 is allowing for a graduated income tax. 17, I talked to you about in terms of the direct election of senators. And the 18th Amendment was prohibition. And then the 19th Amendment was women having the right to vote. Now, there's a very bizarre sort of controversy between Ballinger and Pinchot. Okay, and this happens under Taft. So Richard Ballinger is the Secretary of the Interior. That's the head of all federal lands. And he actually believed that Teddy and Pinchot had reserved too much land for forests. So Ballinger decides to sell some of that land to mining and lumber companies. Okay, well, Pinchot doesn't like this. And he basically says, you know what, he's exploiting, Mother Nature, and he gets really pissed off, and he goes to Taft, and Taft doesn't like it, that he's sort of being insubordinate. And then Pinchot runs and talks to the press, and it looks really ugly. It looks like Pinchot, who's Roosevelt's boy, is going against Taft, and it creates even more dissension. And again, this is about land and forest reserves. But in many ways, it's one of those issues that strains the relationship. The once great relationship between Taft and Roosevelt is going to cause Roosevelt to come back and run in 1912. So because he hadn't only run for one time, so he filled out McKinley's term, he ran for another term, and then he's off for 4 years. He actually comes back in 1912. So it's a four-way race. You've got Taft, who's the incumbent Republican, and he stresses that economic individualism, again, working hard, on your own, could remain the foundation of the social order so long as government and private entrepreneurs cooperated in addressing social ills. So he basically is like, the government doesn't need to take over the economy. They can work together. Now, one of the other candidates, Eugene V. Debs, again, of the Socialist Party, which had been created about 11 years earlier, there are very few people that actually were Socialist Party members, but there were attractive elements of their platform. Again, owning the railroads by the government taking over the banking system. Again, something that is sort of, like a national bank, but even more so, giving aid to the unemployed, shorter working hours, a minimum wage. Again, these are ideas that we've seen from Knights of Labor, from the populists, and now being argued for by the socialists. So we have Taft, who's the incumbent Republican. We have Eugene V. Debs, who's a socialist. And then we have another sort of Republican, Teddy, who didn't get the Republican Party nomination. Taft did. So he forms his own party called the Progressive Party. And then you've got a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. So you've got the incumbent Republican, Taft. You've got the socialist, Debs. You've got the Progressive Party, Teddy. And then you've got the Democrat, Wilson. And it really became a race just between Roosevelt and Wilson. And they both believed that the government was needed to preserve individual freedom. That, again, that's important. That sort of whole Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian idea that in order to have the freedom that Jefferson wants, you got to have a bigger government like Hamilton wanted. But they had different ways of sort of getting at how to protect that particular freedom. Now, Wilson had an idea called the New Freedom, and he insisted that democracy must be reinvigorated by really restoring market competition. And what that means is really getting rid of all trusts. So the market could only be competitive if all trusts were gone, okay? And so for him, antitrust laws were very, very important. He also believed that workers' rights, particularly union rights, needed to be protected. And he was really sort of believed in small business, that he looked at how big business had dominated throughout the Gilded Age and thought that was really problematic. So he believed in what we would call much more of a free market. He believed in small business. He believed in worker protections. Now, the Roosevelt folks looked at Wilson. They're like, "You are a complete antique. Like, we're not in an age of small business anymore. Like, what are you talking about?" Okay. Now, Roosevelt and his Progressive Party, they espouse something called New Nationalism. So, geez. So Wilson has New Freedom. Teddy has New Nationalism. And for him, he's going to call on heavy taxes on personal and corporate fortunes. So again, he's trying to make sure that the wealthy are paying. And he also is calling for federal regulation of industries, including railroads, mining, and oil. So yes, he's a progressive as well. And I'll talk much more in the lecture that even under his New Nationalism plan, he didn't want to get rid of all monopolies like Wilson did. But the Progressive Party is pretty progressive overall. You've got settlement house activists and labor reformers and, again, social scientists. And they're laying out what in many ways will almost be like Teddy's cousin FDR's plan during the New Deal. So they call for women's suffrage, they call for federal supervision of corporate enterprise, and they're looking for health legislation for women and children, a living wage for all workers, a national system of social insurance covering unemployment, like having unemployment insurance, having medical care and old age. That's something that we now call Medicare, and we've had it pretty much since LBJ. So it's a really progressive agenda. At the same time, Teddy's got some sort of old school views on citizenship. And so he believes basically that citizenship and your fitness for it is really inborn and related to your past experiences. So, of course, slaves whose descendants come from Africa could not really assimilate in his mind. And so he felt like, in his own words, only people with capacity for self-control, which is, incredibly racist overall, thinking that only native-born white people have that. And in a famous speech that he gave at Osawatomie in Kansas, not to be confused with Potawatomi and John Brown in 1910, in his New Nationalism speech, he said that to be a proper American required a certain type of wealth, basically. So, I mean, while he was fighting for the little guy, ultimately, he basically was like, to be a good citizen, you had to have some money. Now, that was a very sort of gendered, very male way of looking at it. But in 1912, he actually came out for women's suffrage. And, despite the fact that he was, racist towards blacks and Asian Americans, he actually, at the end of the day, was actually more open than most of his contemporaries. But he still loses. Okay, he loses to Woodrow Wilson because Taft and Roosevelt sort of split that Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson does become the president, takes over in 1913. And Woodrow Wilson gets a ton done. So he's going to sign a bunch of laws. One is the Underwood Tariff, which reduces tariffs. Remember, Republicans like higher tariffs, Democrats like lower tariffs. So he actually reduces tariffs, good for the little guy, not as good for business. Remember, he was never pro big business. But in order to really make up for revenue that would come in for the tariff, they basically create a law that allows for an income tax. So even though the 16th Amendment had allowed for an income tax, it just means that the government can do it. The Underwood Tariff is the first time that you actually do have this graduated income tax. So an amendment allows for the government to do it, then you have to pass a law for the government to actually do it. We had the Sherman Antitrust Act, which wasn't really used that much in the Gilded Age and started to be used more in the 1900s. But then you're going to get a new one, the Clayton Antitrust Act. And very explicitly, it basically says, labor unions cannot be prosecuted under antitrust laws. As we had seen, remember, Sherman Antitrust had been used against labor unions. And it also basically says you can't have injunctions stopping strikes, like we'd seen certainly at Pullman. So very pro-labor. You have the Keating-Owen Act, which outlines child labor for any goods that are sold across state lines, again, making sure that children are protected. And then the Adamson Act establishes an 8-hour workday on the nation's railroads. Again, going back to that whole idea of the Holy Trinity, getting fewer hours. And then lastly, you have something called the Warehouse Act, which was actually something that the populists had wanted, which basically means when farmers store their crops as they're waiting to be picked up, they can get credit. So again, it was a populist plan, never approved, but it gets approved under Wilson. Now, Wilson has some pretty big agencies that he creates. One that is still around and very, very important today. Both of them are still around that I'm going to mention, but the Fed, or the Federal Reserve System. So we'd obviously had, two national banks, or two BOTUSes. Then we had sort of a national banking system created under Lincoln, but this is going to be the most comprehensive. So it's going to create the Federal Reserve System, which consists of 12 different regional banks that are all under control of this bigger Federal Reserve Bank. And it allows for the issuance of currency. It can help banks that are in the danger of failing, and most importantly, really influence interest rates to promote economic growth. Now, in many ways, this was designed to make sure that there weren't panics. So 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, there've been so much up and down. Now the government's like, no, we can actually put the brakes on the economy when we need to, or put money out there when we need to. And then in addition, you have the Federal Trade Commission, which was designed to investigate and prohibit unfair business practices, such as price fixing and just general monopolies. So again, many of the efforts that were supposed to have been made in the Gilded Age, like Sherman Antitrust, are now actually being made with the FTC and the Clayton Antitrust Act. And again, just as we saw with, earlier business restrictions that you thought businesses would dislike, and they surprisingly did like because it instilled customer confidence. The Fed and the FTC were welcomed by business leaders because they're like, you know what, we would like some stability and order in the economic marketplace. And at the same time, it's not that radical. So it's not like the socialists got what they wanted in terms of like the government fully taking over. It's creating order, but not taking over. So I know this was all over the place. I did my best. I hope it wasn't too crazy. There's my deep breath.